Welcome, everybody. My name is Alan Knapp. I'm the interim director of the graduate degree program in ecology, and I'm here today to introduce the person who's going to introduce our speaker today. But before I do that, I want to give you a bit of background about this series. Those of you who were here last time with Leroy Poff's presentation heard a bit of this, but I want to remind all of us where we are right now. About a decade ago, the GDP program essentially brought in 5 outside distinguished ecologists each year to speak to us and to interact with our students. We realized about a decade ago that we had a lot of really great folks here as well, and so we changed the program to bring in some resident distinguished ecologists as well, and that was Leroy last time. We also realized that as a program that was, well, it's now over 25 years old, and it's a program and a university that produced a lot of great ecologists. We had a lot of great alums that were distinguished in their own rights, and we should bring them back as well. And so that's what we're here for today, for the GDPE Distinguished Alumni Seminar. I asked a trivia question last time, which David Cooper, I believe, got right. I'm going to ask another one. Our speaker today is number 11 in the series. Anyone remember who the first alum brought back was for GDPE? There was like 5 free drink coupons for that answer as well. David got one, but I didn't give it to him. It was Marianne Vinton. Anyone remember the name Marianne Vinton? So she was the first GDPE graduate. I think she's still at Creighton University. I believe that's right. And she was our first speaker to be honored. So today we're going to have Brandon Bestelmeyer speak to us, and Jen Timmer is going to do the introduction, since this is an award, an honor that is nominated by students and hosted by the students.
Hello. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Brandon Bestelmeyer today for our distinguished alumni ecologist. After graduating from CNCU in 2000, Dr. Bestelmeyer served as a research ecologist with the USDA Agricultural Research Service, or ARS, at the Jornada Experimental Range in Las Cruces, New Mexico. He also served as a co-PI for the Jornada Basin LTER, and he is now a research leader at ARS with Jornada. He's published over 120 papers in journals such as Ecology, Rangeland Ecology and Management, and the Journal of Applied Ecology. And he's also been cited over 3,000 times. Dr. Bestelmeyer serves as adjunct faculty at New Mexico State University. He serves on the editorial board for several journals, and he's also served on the science committee for the Ecological Society of America. In addition to all these projects in the US, he's also worked with management agencies and institutions around the world, primarily Mongolia, China, and Argentina. And some of the grad students here at CSU are more familiar with Dr. Bestelmeyer's work with ecological site descriptions and state and transition models. And many times in the field when our survey team was driving through the sagebrush country, we would always ask ourselves, what would Bestelmeyer do? How do you actually do a low intensity traverse? How much variability do you include in your sampling plot? So maybe later he can answer that for us at the social. But without further ado, Dr. Bestelmeyer.
Well, thank you very much. That's a great honor. I feel like I was very well served by my graduate experience here at Colorado State University. I thought what I would do, so very generally, I'm interested in ecological transitions and how that information about them can be used to promote sustainable management. And I'm taking a turn toward social science without really knowing what I'm doing at the moment. But what I thought I would do is give you a little bit of background on my career here. So that's me, and I have to use my glasses now. But that's me and my advisor, John Weens, in 1991. And that's me and John at the IALI meeting where he received a Lifetime Achievement Award last year. And so my thinking has changed a lot over that nearly 25-year period. That's us in the Chaco, where I got my master's thesis off the ground. And this was a great initial opportunity for me. I came as a master's student really not knowing at all what I was going to do. I was interested in animals, in particular small mammals, and I did know some Spanish, and so I showed up when John and Enrique Bucher, a researcher from Argentina, they had a U.S. Man in the Biosphere program grant to look at the effects of land use on biodiversity in the Argentine Chaco. In particular, comparing this gradient that you see here down in the bottom between areas that were near to water points where there were settlements called puestos, and areas that were further away into areas that where rotational grazing was performed. And so he said, "You want to go to Argentina?" And I said, "Yeah, that would be good." So I initially was going to look at the small mammals. I borrowed somebody's traps from the wildlife department here and brought them down in a great big duffel bag. I set up a bunch of Sherman live trap for catching the small mammal arrays. And I came back the next day and they were shot up and stolen and smashed by some of the local residents. And so I'm sitting, you're there for a couple months. You don't get to fly back home and replan. So I was looking on the ground, there were tons of ants. And so I started on a decade career working on ants. And this was sort of, all the ecosystem dynamics, it was really kind of in the background for me. I was interested in biodiversity, and land use was this very abstract impact on biodiversity. And this was my sort of first implicit ecosystem model that there would be in some of these areas that were near to the water points, overgrazing, degradation, and there was then a transition from that to this, more lush, grassy savanna state through fencing and brush management, and that would result in increasing ant biodiversity. Well, I kind of carried on with that theme through my PhD work, and so I worked at a cross-site LTER grant. There was a program through NSF at that time to specifically target comparisons between the LTER sites. And I kind of carried over this idea that, okay, we're going to look at ant biodiversity across a gradient from degraded land conditions to conditions that were more healthy. And so that was the beginning of my interest in the Jornada. And my wife, Stephanie Besselmeyer, finished the same year I did, and we were sort of hanging there with no real plans for employment after we finished, but she was interested in moving into environmental education after she did her PhD work on the behavior of maned wolves in Brazil. So that's Steph here doing some radio tracking for collared maned wolves. And she landed a job with the Chihuahuan Desert Nature Park. It was advertised right when we finished, and that was in Las Cruces, New Mexico, associated with the Jornada Basin LTER. And I came as the following trailing spouse. I struggled mightily for 6 months trying to get some money, and then I got a postdoc, and that postdoc was with the Jornada Experimental Range, where I've sort of maintained my career for a long time now, so 15 years, I guess. And so for those of you who don't know, the Jornada Experimental Range is run by the Agricultural Research Service. This was withdrawn from the public domain for rangeland research in 1912. We have a 301 square mile area where we do livestock and ecological research. We host the Jornada Basin LTER. We also have a NEON site. We also have a long-term agroecosystem research site at the Jornada. And we have 21 total scientists and postdocs and lots of technical and administrative staff. So we're a pretty big unit doing lots of interesting stuff. And so for you students, look us up when you get out on the job market. Assuming things stay the way they have been in the next year, we'll be able to employ you, potentially. And so what I've been working on, what I was hired on for my postdoc, and I've kind of fell in love with and stuck with throughout my career, is the use of state and transition models as a way of capturing information about ecological dynamics and using that for management. State and transition models conceptualize ecological communities, vegetation communities mostly, in discrete states, and there are transitions between those states, these arrows here, that can be controlled by management or climatic conditions or weather events. and in particular the relationship of the state and transition model conception with two fundamental models of ecological dynamics. The linear model, where, for example, we have vegetation biomass on the y-axis, and we have a driver such as herbivory on the x-axis, and there's very smooth responses such as I assumed were taking place in my master's and PhD work with respect to the vegetation. We have an increase in the driver, a decrease in the driver, and there's very smooth responses out of the vegetation, as opposed to the multiple stable state model, where there can be very strong nonlinear changes and hysteresis. So as we move back on our herbivory driver, for example, we may not have a very smooth recovery of the vegetation. It may be held by feedbacks in an alternative state, and we tend to have multiple states at the same level of our driver, such as herbivory. So the funding for my postdoc and for a lot of my work since has been from federal agencies such as the Bureau of Land Management and especially the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which has taken upon itself the task of producing state and transition models for every land type within the United States. It was of course born in rangelands, this idea, but it is now being extended to forests and even croplands. And so the interest is in, broadly epicosystem health, how to define reversible versus threshold behavior in these ecosystems. How do we define what the indicators of an impending threshold are that would signal a shift in ecosystem services and a difficulty in recovering desired conditions as well as restoration options. And so what I'm going to talk about here for a little bit is how to assemble and integrate multiple sources of evidence to produce these types of models. And I have my little sad ant there because this sort of marked the departure in terms of my research interests from ant community ecology after I discovered that nobody cared other than other ant ecologists. I mean, there's a good history there in terms of bioindication, but it just was not going to work into the American land management system the way I hoped it would. And so this was my new love, grassland, shrubland transitions, and this is a little summary for the Chihuahuan Desert. That background that you're seeing there is sort of what we consider to be the historical or reference condition of a black grama grassland. We have, as part of the Jornada experimental range and also part of the Jornada Basin LTER, some of the oldest monitoring in the western United States. These are plots, those little squares there, where vegetation has been mapped since, in some cases, 1915. So we just this year now collected our 101th year of vegetation data from those plots. In a lot of those plots, they started photographing them in the 1930s, and so you see here what an overgrazed black grama grassland looks like in the 1930s, and this is what it looks like 2 weeks ago. No perennial grasses at all. Lots of little perennial grasses you see here, but no perennial grasses in 2016 and lots of mesquite shrubs on the sandy alluvial plain. So this kind of dynamic has occurred throughout the southwestern United States within black grama grasslands. And the causes are multiple. And we think of this really as a social ecological transition that was driven primarily by the Homestead Act in the 1860s. Following the secession of the South, the Homestead Act was passed, and people started showing up. And in particular, they started showing up when there was a very severe drought in the southern plains, and there was abundant forage in the Southwest, and people wanted to graze it, and the way they could get there was because of some new technology, the railroads. This allowed the cattle to be shipped in and also the beef to be shipped out of the region. And then of course there had to be demand for this beef, and there was plenty of demand in the East, and there was also financing from the East and also from the United Kingdom to build up these really big cattle ranches, which were viewed as a very good investment because you're dealing with free land and pretty much unregulated grazing access. And so the initial effects of that cattle boom were some very seriously denuded landscapes in the 1890s and the early 1900s, as well as other desperate measures such as cutting down some of our succulents to ensile them for cattle forage, and of course there were the inevitable die-offs and sell-offs during the drought. And this led to one of the seminal publications that led to the foundation of the Jornada Experimental Range, the Range Problem in New Mexico, by Elmer Otis Wooten, that suggested that we needed large landscape experiments on sustainable grazing practices to solve this kind of a problem. And so what we see over time, this is now within the Jornada, is sort of a recognition of limits. There's also environmental degradation going on. The forage base is declining, and we see through the successive drought periods an attempt, after the mid-1920s, to sort of raise stocking rates back up. Can you guys see my cursor? Okay, yep, it goes up, and then we hit the 1950s drought, which I've got the little blue bar around, and that was really a fundamental change throughout the Southwest, and especially on the Jornada. They overestimated the resilience of that system. They actually supplemented some of the cattle herds out in certain pastures with mineral nutrients and also hay. And of course, that just kept them out on the range a lot longer, and we lost our black grama grasslands. You can sort of see what that looks like in the background here. Imagine that looking initially like that first slide I showed of the black grama. And so now we have sort of about 6,000 AUMs, for example, as our stocking rate on the Jornada. And then in the context of that loss of vegetation, it was sort of the template for reorganization. And so we see shrub invasion and proliferations that started in the 1930s and really got underway in the 1950s. There was no grass to compete with the shrubs. You had plenty of cattle out there to redistribute the mesquite seeds. They eat the pods, poop them out, and that creates favorable germination environment for the shrubs. And so the system has been gradually becoming a shrubland over that time period. So what have we learned since? So this is sort of the background for the state transitions that have occurred on the Jornada and throughout the Southwest. What can we use ecological science for in terms of recommending management? So I'm just going to go through a series of results from the Jornada Basin LTER and the experimental range. This is some work from a grad student of mine, Derek Goolsby, where he used aerial photography to reconstruct the advance of the shrubs from the 1940s to the present. And what we see is even in areas that were ungrazed, that those shrubs have been continuing to advance. This picture here is of an exclosure that was set up under the assumption in the 1930s that we would be able to recover grasses if we protected it from additional grazing. And as you see, it just gets swallowed up. Once you lose all that grass, soil erosion is moving these loamy sands throughout the landscape, and it becomes unstoppable, and it's very contagious, as you can sort of see in this series of the black areas that keep expanding. But we also see that in areas outside of those mesquite dunes, that grasses and shrubs can coexist across a moderate range of shrub cover. And so this is a very simple inventory data set that nobody had ever bothered to collect before. That is very instructive. We have perennial grasses on the y-axis here and shrub canopy cover on the x-axis, and there's two things to note. One is that beyond about 15% foliar cover of the shrubs, we begin to see a constraint on the possible grass cover. And so this is an important management threshold at 15%. We don't want to go over that, or we're going to see continuing constraints on grass production. The other is that in areas even with very little grass cover, we can have very low perennial grass cover. And so that speaks to the fact that it's not just the shrubs that are responsible for declines in grasses, as was commonly assumed, but grazing management is having an impact independent of the shrubs. Once those shrubs dominate, removing them to recover the perennial grasses can be quite risky, especially when you've let the shrub encroachment proceed to the point, or the loss of grasses proceed to the point where you only have a very few remnant grasses to repopulate that area. And so if you have sufficient number of grasses, you'll get good recovery. If you don't, and there's been a lot of soil erosion, and as we've found, you're on a loamy soil surface that has, the grasses have trouble germinating on, you can actually create a true desert out of a shrubland if you treat it with herbicide. With regard to the grasses, it's important to pay attention to their cover and avoid critical thresholds. This is some work we did where we looked at historical transect data within two pastures, one shown in black and the other in yellow. And what we showed is that after the 1950s drought, there was a collapse in the standardized metric. The production anomaly is a standardized z-score of the black grama cover. After the 1950s drought, it never recovered. And you can see on that right-hand graph, we had similar amounts, a similar range of monsoonal rainfall pre and post this arrow here, so the pre-threshold and the post-threshold. But after the threshold, we see that we never get the level of black grama production that we were able to get before the threshold. In other words, you can have high rainfall after the threshold, but you still don't get the black grama cover. So this is a very classic empirical example now of an ecological threshold in a terrestrial system. However, we did another experiment that showed that grasses can be rescued if grazing pressure is reduced in time. So here we have a very large scale experiment that you can see from Google Earth, where we have a number of paddocks that received either very heavy grazing pressure or were ungrazed, and we established this in a moderately grazed pasture. So you can see here in this dotted line that has biomass removal on the y-axis that we had very intensive defoliation, about 80% defoliation of those perennial grasses using a very concentrated herd of livestock for a 4-year period, and then we let it, we dropped it to no grazing. And then we have our control plots here shown in gray. And what we see is this pattern of recovery from the moderately grazed condition in the control, and this is where we thought we would be able to induce this threshold that we saw in the historical data. And what we see is that even after 4 years of very heavy grazing, there was still recovery. And so we postulate that we never quite got below the threshold required to flip this over into an eroding state that was where the erosion rates were high enough to circumvent the recovery of black grama. If we had maybe gone to 1%, we probably would have lost all of the black grama from this system. And we actually see indications of that in that bottom plot there. Is still having trouble recovering. So based upon this result, we now have another management recommendation: don't let your black grama go below 5% foliar cover. However, once we get into these dunelands, we never see the black grama come back, and there's a number of reasons for that. Black grama is a perennial grass. It reproduces vegetatively. Under current climate, it has a great deal of difficulty in our area reproducing by seed. But there is another grass, Sporobolus species, that we didn't think would come back either until a big, very extreme rainfall event in 2006. And we had a decent rainfall in 2007. And then in 2008, we had the remnants of Hurricane Dolly come through, which dumped a lot more rain. And those 3 years of very high rainfall led to a spectacular recruitment of Sporobolus in areas that we thought were not capable of supporting that kind of perennial grass cover. So this is it's a good example of a novel ecosystem, something that never existed previously, that was sort of built on this degraded state, but nonetheless has a great deal of value. And so what we've done is taken these results and a bunch of other results and tried to package them together in management recommendations within state and transition models. And I'm not going to go over this model in detail, but I did want to introduce you to a website that we've developed where we're going to allow people to build state and transition models, build the narratives, and also keys to this information. So you would start out at this edit.hornada.nmsu. We have catalogs that we've built that are potentially global. So we would go to the US catalog. You could use geolocation on a smartphone to get to your ecoregion, which would be our blue area here. And then from that, so you can sort of, geolocate your way to the domain of a particular state and transition model only to a point, and then you don't have any more map data to help guide you. So we've created a key to the soil landform types that would get you to a particular state and transition model. Then you would go through another key to get to the ecological state. And then once you click on an ecological state, there are a number of management interpretations where some of our previous results that I just showed would be made available. And we think this is an effective model for translating some of the ecological science that we've done into practical management tools. And so the hope is, of course, that these tools can support and maintain a social ecological transition that's been underway for quite some time. So this is your classic social ecological system. In the unsustainable livestock production regime, we had humans not fully understanding the consequences of decision making on the environment, causing state changes, and then reducing ecosystem services, in particular grazing, within that system. Ecological change, of course, and the realization of that change, learning that occurred certainly before the state and transition models, but that can be maintained by those state and transition model, and changes in policy has led to sustainable production at reduced capacity, as well as guidelines for restoration. But, and this is where things get a little bit murky for me, looking into the future, another social ecological transition is underway, where here we're sort of undergoing a transition in human-environment relationships within the same land use system, but we're now shifting out of that grazing-dominated land use system into a number of other uses, including urban development, certainly priorities for recreation, and as we move forward, renewable energy uses. So some of the patterns that we're seeing within the region around the Hornada experimental range, we see continuing declines in livestock numbers well below our current carrying capacity. And so this is a pretty important change in land use that is not easily tied to changes in productive capacity. We see increases in rural housing units over the last decade. We also see that ranch value within the public, so there's a combination of private and public land that is the basis for ranches. The private land portions of that are increasing, but very little of that value is coming from livestock production. And this is because a lot of the ranchers, for example, are using it for amenity purposes. They just want to be able to ranch in areas, and they come with their own resources to support a ranching lifestyle. And then, of course, they're also using these ranches as tax shelters. Only 41% of the ranchers within our region were reliant on ranch income in 2011. Another important driver is globalization. We see here on the top graph the volume of exports from the West Coast of hay. And hay is particularly important in the Southwest because there are dry periods, there are droughts, and our perennial forages are insufficient to keep livestock alive through those periods. So you have to buy hay. And during this time period when we see increasing volume of hay exports to Asia and the Middle East, we see locally hay prices increasing pretty dramatically, and that's putting the squeeze on a lot of the ranchers who are getting out of the business. And we see evidence for that. We see a decline in family ranching as evidenced by, on the y-axis here, the number of allotment transfers to family members, which would indicate a continuity of the ranching operation within the family. The number of those transactions has been steadily declining over the last several decades based upon Bureau of Land Management records. This is particularly significant when you consider that the average age of farmers and ranchers in New Mexico is 60 years old. So we've got a lot of old ranchers, and they're not transferring to family members at the rate you would expect. And based upon some work that Sam Perry did for his thesis, 20% of the ranchers in the area had no plan to transfer their ranch to family members. So that opens up a lot of possibilities for what's going to happen next. And one of those is a renewable energy pathway. Fortunately for solar energy companies, and unfortunately perhaps for us, we are in a hotspot in southwestern New Mexico for renewable energy development. You can sort of see that little outline there, that little red area is a high priority solar energy zone. In this map, which is a programmatic environmental impact statement that was developed nationwide with input from the states, all those blue areas are public land areas where there is potential for solar energy development. And I learned last week, or 2 weeks ago, that because of the election, Obama is trying to fast track solar energy development within these areas. So we may see some pretty rapid requests for utility scale solar energy developments in the years to come. So now the question before us in this area is, how do we want the social ecological mosaic to look at a broader scale? We know that there are multiple land uses that have become important, and I'm beginning to think now about not just grazing land uses, but of the integration of multiple land uses and ecosystem services across the landscape. And this cartoon, the moment I saw it, created by the Quivira Coalition, an NGO in New Mexico, sort of captures what I think, and maybe utopian, but at the very least optimistic, vision of reconciling wild areas, natural areas. We have degraded land, we have livestock production, we have the semi-wild cultivated areas, and we have urban and wild land. And so the question is, acknowledging that there's inevitably going to be change, how do we reconcile and integrate ecosystem services at the landscape level? I don't think we can talk solely about individual sites anymore. There's places we're going to have to let go from our preferred land use. And so how do we organize our thinking at the landscape level? And this is where I think state and transition models can continue to make a contribution. And this is an example where we have essentially mapped ecological states across a couple of different soil types to help the BLM locate solar energy priority area within public lands near Las Cruces. And in particular, so what we see here, the green areas are remnant perennial grasslands, our reference conditions. We have areas that are shrub invaded in yellow, but can still be restored or that have important uses. And then we have our shrublands, those mesquite dunelands that may be regarded as degraded. And so maybe the logic here would be to minimize ecological and agricultural impact by focusing urban development on those sorts of states. So I wanted to go back to the Chaco for a moment, because as soon as I started doing that and thinking this way, I thought about this example that I've been tracking. So this is the area where I did my master's thesis in the early 1990s. Once again, our land use gradient, the Puesto here, where you see some bare areas, and then biospheres of vegetation change around those areas. And so what I didn't really talk about what I found during my master's thesis, but my thesis and then some subsequent work indicated that that whole mosaic, including both the degraded and the restored areas, had very high biodiversity. There was a lot of beta turnover, but there were a lot of valuable species in these areas that we were calling degraded. But taken together, we had spectacular biodiversity. Unfortunately, this is one of the hot spots, at least as a couple of years ago, for deforestation worldwide. This is being driven primarily by massive demand for soybeans and also for intensive pasture use. So this area on the left is what my study area looked like in the 1970s, and that little star is my study area as it existed several years ago. I keep tracking it on Google Earth to see when my study area gets swallowed up by soybeans. There are a number of drivers of this kind of land use change. There has been increased rainfall that reduces the risk of crop failure for soybeans. We have new technologies, once again, genetically modified soybeans, no-till farming methods. There's also a policy aspect, very weak land tenure by those puesteros that live in the area that allows the government to transfer their land to large landowners. And this was an interesting point that was made in this paper by Ana Murkida, that the degradation narrative that I had been using for my master's thesis was part of the justification for policies that favored this alternative land use. They figured, well, if it's all degraded land and we can't restore it anyway, why not put it to more productive use, even though it was a very high biodiversity area? That message never got through. So one caution in how you frame your question, the degradation narrative that sometimes we feel might motivate sustainable use and restoration can also facilitate a change from wildland, rangeland uses to other uses. So I wanted to end on a more positive note and sort of taking into account a lot of the stuff that we've learned. We've begun working in Mongolia in 2006 and much more intensively in 2008 with an NGO, Green Gold Mongolia, and also with the More 2 group with Maria Fernandez Jimenez and her students. And you can read a little bit more about this program and our involvement in it at this Hornada website. If you just type in Hornada Mongolia, you can see some of the products there. This is another example of a social ecological transition associated with the collapse of the communist government and the privatization of livestock that was formerly publicly owned. We see very steep increases in livestock numbers, and each of those black dots indicates a severe weather event, usually a drought, summer drought, that then is followed by a very cold or snowy winter called a dzud. And what we see is that for a number of reasons, those dzuds did not have very significant impact on livestock numbers prior to the early 1990s. And then we see this cycle of increasing livestock numbers and collapse and rebuilding again and collapse that's associated with the current regime. And it is believed that this has been causing widespread desertification. This was repeated in the New York Times. This is a value from the Ulaanbaatar Post, that desertification is affecting 77% of Mongolia. And so we see the degradation narrative taking form once again in Mongolian rangelands. And so what we've done, and I think what's really important to emphasize here relatively quickly, is pull together what information was available and some of our approaches to land classification and model development to quickly produce a framework for interpreting land within Mongolia, and also, of course, with the results from the More 2 project. So we have 25 land classes across the country that we identified through inventory of landform soils and vegetation, and state and transition models were developed for each of those land classes. The state and transition models are really a best guess based upon expert opinion within both the herding and the academic communities within Mongolia, as well as the results of exclosure studies. And so what we've done is taken an existing monitoring network that was established in the Soviet times within, or at the time of Soviet influence within Mongolia, 1,450 monitoring points that they have people to monitor, which is really, truly remarkable. and then use these state transition model keys to classify those points to what we call recovery classes. So we're avoiding the term degradation in this case and basically asking what would it take for those systems to recover toward a desirable or reference condition. And what we see is that 62% of those monitoring points across Mongolia are either undegraded or only very slightly degraded, to use the old language, and could be recovered relatively quickly. And only 7% of these areas have been changed to the point where we think recovery could be indefinitely delayed. So the message here, and this is something that Maria and her students are also echoing at the very same time, is that while some rangelands are at risk, adjustments to herd management now could be used to prevent persistent transitions, and perhaps even more importantly, that those rangelands are not irreversibly degraded, they're not desertified, and they are not wastelands. This is an example of one of the green gold scientists explaining a state and transition model as part of a pasture management development process with one of the local pasture user groups. So the primary tool moving forward in this system is the use of rangeland use agreements between the herders and herder organizations with the local government as a primary tool for restoration. These voluntary agreements define rights and responsibilities for both the herders and the government, sort of centered around the restoration approaches that are described in the state and transition model, usually some combination of destocking and deferred grazing in certain pastures. The government then recognizes and enforces the land tenure of the herder groups as part of these agreements, and that allows the herders not only to control pasture use much more effectively, it also allows them to control conversion to alternative land uses more effectively. The simple act of mapping these agreements within the government may be the most important outcome of this process for the herders. So, that was all pretty wide-ranging. I would try to distill it with some relatively simple conclusions. First, we do understand a lot about social ecological transitions, even though this is pretty new language. When I was a beginning graduate student here in the early 1990s, there were no social ecological systems. Human beings were a driver of change, and our primary focus was the ecology of the system, biodiversity, environmental health. Now we're beginning to view, and I think not beginning, we've really consolidated our view of coupled human-natural systems where our interest is not just in the ecology, but the relationships between ecology and local communities. I think this is going to be a very important idea for us to communicate to the broader world going forward if ecology is going to survive with the levels of support and funding that it has in the past. Can ecologists contribute to the management of these social ecological transitions that are driven by lots of different forces? Well, I think that knowledge synthesis using tools such as state transition models and making them broadly available with the technologies we have at hand, mobile phones for example, can help with some types of transitions, especially if we're talking about transitioning within a particular land use. But there are other types of transitions, as we are seeing now in the Southwest, that are driven very strongly by external forces such as energy goals or new markets. In both of these cases, I think it's very important to be aware of the unintended consequences of degradation narratives where, as I explained earlier, we may inadvertently be supporting land use transitions that we really don't want by calling a place degraded. So that's all I have. If you have any questions or discussions to promote, I would be happy to take it.
Time for questions?
Yes.
I was wondering if in the Jornada where you saw the sporobolus that came in after that rainfall anomaly, if you have any signals suggesting that might be part of a transition back to a black grama grassland, or is that not a trajectory you could ever see that going?
Yeah, I think this is, it's a novel ecosystem is what we're dealing with now. So we see no evidence for any recruitment of black grama back into that system. And part of the reason is, again, the reproductive strategy of the black grama, and there's also been significant soil changes. So the soils, there's been deflation in the interspaces between the shrubs, and then there's been essentially a massive change in soil texture throughout that system. So now, though, we're thinking about, okay, let's promote Sporobolus. Let's give up. I mean, we preserve the black grama where there is black grama. But now we're going to start trying to seed Sporobolus in places that didn't get that recruitment. One possibility is it didn't get recruitment in certain areas because the seed source wasn't there. If we can overcome that, let's start managing for this novel ecosystem type, which of course carries its own set of controversies. Yes?
That's a great talk, thank you. Is there a uniqueness to Mongolia for these types of voluntary agreements that you discussed? Or, I mean, how could we get those either here in the US, or, I mean, how would you go about doing that in other countries? So, could you speak a little bit to the uniqueness of Mongolia?
Yeah, no. I would imagine that there are other systems, perhaps in Africa. I'm not actually all that familiar with the details of how, but this is based upon a communal management sort of system. In the U.S., of course, it's private ownership, or you have exclusive use of particular grazing allotments. But I think the ideas of managing for sort of broader ecosystem health goals is sort of, it's already present in the U.S., for example. It's just dealt with in a different way. Usually incentives provided by the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and then also regulations with the Bureau of Land Management. Yes?
Speaking of the Bureau of Land Management, as an employee of them, the last line, their unintended consequences, and as an agency, we are now employing a lot of what we call restoration or wildlife habitat projects, doing vegetation treatments, without really, I think we're going to get to this possibly unintended consequences of doing treatments on the ground. One, it's because we get money, and we don't know all of the factors, and what we could be doing is actually, I think, thinking we're restoring it, but actually not. And so how do we, again, and this is really interesting, I'd like to actually talk to you about this in more detail, but how, again, is how do we, it's more of a statement, not a question, but again, trying to look at we tend to jump in with both feet. And it's almost like we need to take a step back and look at some of what the research says, and a lot of this is driven by, as you said, mentioned politics and funding levels. Yeah. So I don't really have a question. It's more of just a comment.
Yeah, and so one of our programs is to put some science into. I am just there. We're working with Bureau of Land Management, Las Cruces District Office. So it's an area about 6 million acres. That's one of the bigger district offices, to monitor their Restore New Mexico program. So the Restore New Mexico program, of course, takes as its inspiration a lot of the Jornada work that indicates that everything was formerly a grassland, and it's converted to shrubland. If we get rid of the shrubs, we release the grasses from competition. The grasses will come back.
Years ago, BLM chained and got rid of sagebrush across large expanses,
Yep.
and now we're protecting it and for a certain bird. So
exactly, yeah. So and so some of the examples, one of the examples I showed earlier showed that if you do it in the wrong circumstances, you actually create desertification. You'll actually create more soil erosion than you had. But your motivation is to go back to the grassland, so you may accept some of those losses for the gains. We haven't measured all the ecosystem consequences, so some of them are good. Even if the grasses don't come back, it's still better for some species that prefer open systems. So what was interesting that we found with respect to some of the birds, which is actually similar to some of the work that's going on in the shortgrass steppe, is they don't care whether the grasses are there or not. They just don't want the shrubs there. So there's certain species that respond favorably, but then there's other species that don't. And the other issue to think about going forward is climate change. So you got rid of these species that are very well adapted to tolerate drought. And a lot of times what we're replacing them, the black grama doesn't come back into these systems. It's other grasses that are more ruderal. And they'll take advantage of the wet years, but the dry years, they'll disappear. Well, we're going to start looking at NDVI and production over time, and we may be creating systems that are not particularly climate resilient with respect to at least net primary production going forward. And so, you know, in our attempt to want to move back, we're sort of not fully acknowledging that, you know, we've moved on in terms of climate into a new regime. I should probably go over here, sorry.
For using solar panels to facilitate restoration, either for shading the ground or kind of retain soil moisture? Is there any compatibility there?
I've heard people talk about it, and maybe this is, you know, there's the potential, I suppose, to investigate that option. But I think what people want to do is stabilize, so they want to spray something on the soil surface to keep the plants from growing and to keep the soil from moving. And then there's all the associated infrastructure with that is going to lead to a net decrease in vegetation. Yeah, so I think those are exclusive land uses.